45. This is our second panel. I'll say a few words about our panelists whose work will actually be the best introduction. We start off with a presentation by people from the Vera Institute of Justice, which is a long-standing distinguished think tank and action tank for work in the area of criminal justice. Daniel Bodah is a senior program associate in the Redefining Public Safety program at Vera. He's got quite an interesting background, including work in the oversight of the NYPD, work at the International Court of International Trade, and he's currently pursuing a PhD as well as sitting on a JD. Stagoff-Belfort is a program analyst in the same program at Vera. He does a lot of community organizing and works with local governments to try and change law enforcement practice and policy. That's actually our second panel. I neglected our first panel, who I know is going to be known for. My old colleague Jen Wood, formerly of the PHLR program and a professor of criminology at Temple's outstanding criminal justice program, and Evan Anderson, who's a senior lecturer at the nursing school at Penn, also a former fellow at the PHLR program, and somebody who's well known on the local circuit for his work investigating what goes on in Philly's criminal justice, which he'll be talking with Jen. I also want to mention for the circling back to Vera, that this work also includes contributions from someone who isn't here, but I hope is watching, Daniela Gilbert, who's the director of Redefining Public Safety program. Our third presentation will come again from people here at Temple. Jamie Ray-Leonetti, who is the Associate Director of Policy at the Institute of Disabilities here at Temple. And her colleague, Parris, a social worker who's the project coordinator at the Institute of Disabilities. Also, we want to note the contribution of the students at the law school here, Philana Pelligrino, who helps prepare the work for this presentation. And finally, virtually, we will be hearing from a staff attorney at the Network for Public Health Law, April Shaw, who's in the network's northern regional office. She's a lawyer, but also a PhD, and she's working, well, you'll hear about her work. So with no further delay, I'm going to invite Evan and Jen to come and give us their presentation.
Thanks so much, Doc, for the introduction. I just want to make one small addition, because I'm also a product of a law alum. It's always wonderful to be back. Jen and I are going to talk over the next 10 minutes and pass on some of our time for the question and answers about some of our research, our empirical research, which is either underway or upcoming. Specifically, we are helping to evaluate the City of Philadelphia's commitment and implementation of a spectrum of response options for responding to people who are in the community and call 911. We're going to focus our remarks today about the particular process of triage. That word triage comes from the word sorting calls to different response options now that they are increasingly available. We're going to say a little bit about what's known in that process and make some suggestions and talk a little bit about where we hope to take that research as well. And generally speaking, we know that taking calls is incredibly difficult. We know it's toxic. We know communication specialists suffer trauma. It's a traumatizing job. We also know it's really important. The way that calls are assessed, the way that they're communicated, have important downstream effects on the type of response that happens out in the community. So we're really interested in the sort of internal processes that communication specialists use to assess calls and then convey information or otherwise make decisions about the right response. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Jen. We're going to sort of pass it back and forth a little bit, and off to Jen.
Thank you. I just want to set the scene a little bit and mention some important work from our colleague Jerry Ratcliffe at the Department of Criminal Justice here at Temple. Jerry analyzed calls for service to the Philadelphia Police Department. Just to give you a sense of the volume of cold calls for the year 2019, there were over 3 million record entries in the computer-aided dispatch system. You may know that not all calls are dispatchable. They are not all sent to the police. What Jerry looked at was unique calls that were dispatched to police, which were over 1 million for that year. There are dozens and dozens of codes that are used to classify calls when they come in to the center. And so what Jerry did was to group different types of calls into different types of categories, one of which he characterized as public health or medical related calls, which include things like hospital cases, which is a general category. Typical examples of that are where police are called to a scene to transport somebody to a hospital, either for a mental health crisis or for a drug overdose. Welfare checks, sick assists are also general categories that are used to characterize calls of a health-related nature. What Jerry found was that about 8% of calls either started or ended with a health-related nature and resolution. Not all calls that come in and are characterized in a certain way end up being found to have the same characterization. So once a police officer gets to the scene, he or she may adjust that determination of the nature of that call type. Jerry found that approximately 20% of calls aren't necessarily predictable, ultimately based on how they were initially classified. Call classification is a really, really challenging job, and communications professionals are required, of course, to sort, as I mentioned, events and different situations into the categories that are given to them. Jerry has an interesting conclusion in his full analysis, which was recently published in a journal called Crime Science, which is there are many types of calls that seem to merit a different type of response apart from police, right? A health-related response, a social service response, but it's often hard to figure out until you get there what's going on. So he concluded with the provocative point that sometimes the only way to determine if a police response is needed is to send a police response. And this is part of the crux of the challenge here. It's figuring out what's going on before we enlist the appropriate type of responder. Over the last few months, Evan conducted 10 focus groups with Philadelphia police officers from across the city at different ranks with different functions. And one of the questions Evan asked them was, talk about a typical day for you know, in terms of volume of calls, types of calls that you were required to go to. And the ways in which these officers characterized their typical day generally mapped on to Jerry's analysis. If you were to dig into Jerry's paper more fully, you'll see that this meshes quite nicely with how he characterized the CAD data. So depending on where officers were, they had different types of calls that occupied their time. So you'll see references to things like person with a gun, person with a weapon, right? People calling in to address those types of situations. In parts of the city where mental health crises are more prevalent, where there are more concentrations of mental health related events, officers commented on knowing individuals who they helped before in mental health crisis. Domestic situations were also a common event, and sometimes those have a mental health component. Hospital cases, again, that catch-all category of responding to someone in distress, whether it's physical health distress or mental health distress, and bringing them to a hospital for aid. A couple of other points that the officers highlighted is you don't know until you get there. So they said, you know, radio can't tell you exactly what you thought. It's a dynamic situation. They also talked about backlogs. So when they start their shift, they're already dealing with calls that haven't yet been resolved that they have to first deal with before they then go and address the new calls that are coming Just to put the call taking, the triage piece in context here, there's a whole series of decisions, what you might think of as a decision chain that happens, right? You have an initial call for service from a member of the public. And then they phone in to a call taking center, and then you have the communication specialists, right? And they are doing a lot of different types of roles at the same time. They're trying to glean from the information provided from that individual, what's going on, right? Listening to different types of cues about what's going on, classifying that call. They often don't dispatch calls at all. They help a person solve a problem. They help them figure out where best to have that call addressed. When they do dispatch calls, that goes to a dispatcher, right? Who then enlists the appropriate first response, whether it's police or fire or medics. And then you have that response, right? The officer goes out and they engage dynamically with that individual, and then there's a particular outcome that unfolds. This whole chain of dynamic situations obviously must be understood in context, right? In the context of community-based resources, social services, different types of response options that call takers and dispatchers have available to them when they try to match what is the best fit to that type of call. Call takers play a really important job in doing risk appraisals. And based on the signals that they're getting from that person who is calling in, they have to assess the level of danger and safety that may be present in that situation, right? And in that way, they can prime officers. They ultimately have priming effects on whether an officer goes into that scene for being attuned or ready for a safety situation to be there. So I just wanted to put that in context for you that it's a whole series of decisions that happen. Geography matters, calls cluster, different types of calls cluster in space. And geography also matters because depending on the social setting of a call, you're going to have different types of constituents or stakeholders who are going to place different demands or expectations on that call taker. So for example, in a mental health crisis, in a family situation, it is quite common for an individual to say, I would like to have my loved one transported to hospital for a psychiatric evaluation. They are quite clear on what they want. But in other settings, somebody might just want somebody moved, right? So there are different types of demands being placed on call takers and exerting this pressure, right, for a particular type of response. So I'll hand it back over to Evan to talk about what Philadelphia's been doing to innovate in this space.
Thanks so much, Jen. I know we're a little pressed for time. All I'll say here is that there is a spectrum of responses. These numbers are a little bit out of date. This is a slide the city generously allowed us to use. There's a commitment locally to use the response that centers police as infrequently as possible. So as frequently as possible, not have police responding. So our project at this stage is really trying to understand how you can best effectuate that through 911 calls. We think there's a powerful analogy to clinical decision making. Our healthcare system is wonderful, but it's also a source of enormous harm. And part of that, results from the difficulty of diagnosing under pressure. And that's those same sort of dynamics play out powerfully, we think, in the 911 response. A complication locally is that we have a real crisis in terms of responding to 911 calls. There have been quite a few stories lately of people waiting a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes for 911 specialists to answer calls. We've heard through the focus groups, and we think it's potentially a part phenomenon that this results in people sometimes saying that there's a gun when it's not, because they know public has been primed to sort of do that, to sometimes get a quicker response. We have a number of steps moving forward. Our focus groups obviously is one perspective, it's the officer's perspective. We're going to talk to community members. We're going to talk to people implementing the programs, and then we have some quantitative components as well. So delighted to talk more about our work with local innovation at the Q&A. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ed and Jen. Now, Aaron.
Thanks for having us this wonderful symposium. I'm having Stagoff-Belfort and joined by my colleagues Daniel Bodah and Daniel Bodah, our program director, who is in the audience and is working with us on this project. So this winter, the Vera Institute is publishing a literature review of an emerging but critically under-examined body of research on the social and health costs of American policing. The purpose of this literature review is to help bring attention to scientific evidence on the substantial social costs of policing in order to fill the chasm left by traditional approaches measuring the costs and benefits of policing. It calls for the integration of a social cost perspective in the studies of law enforcement effectiveness, and this approach would center communities who are most heavily policed instead of merely police departments and local governments, attending to those with the most to lose and gain from public safety policy. It also seeks to identify gaps in the literature and concludes with a call for future research and inquiry to study the disparate economic, political, social, and health ramifications of policing. And we are presenting a preview of this work. So traditionally, quantitative social science research measuring the cost of policing and its overall impact on public safety relies on what we believe to be an artificially narrow approach to calculating costs and benefits. This evaluation perspective focuses on whether and how much law enforcement tactics and strategies like hotspots policing or problem-oriented policing, as well as staffing, reduce crime, and it typically calculates the cost saved from the prevention of serious criminal offenses. It then subtracts the fiscal investment in policing from its crime reduction benefits. In concert, what these literatures typically show is that the fiscal investment in police is less costly than the crime their presence prevents. Such studies demonstrate that violence and interpersonal harm exact a toll on communities through direct costs like medical insurance bills, lost property, and the loss of life itself. And they also document the indirect social consequences of community violence. This frame has informed public safety policy and practice for decades, and it's filtered into broader public narratives about the role that police play in society. But these literatures, which are then used to assess policing's overall impact on social welfare, are woefully incomplete in both explaining and measuring the true effect that American policing has on communities. When we stop here, we overlook many critical pieces of the puzzle of what contributes to public safety. Budget expenditures only tell a part of the story when it comes to the cost of policing. The enormous social costs of policing are what's left out of this discussion. The American Public Health Association has declared police violence, which often stems from encounters over minor infractions, a public health issue. But beyond acts of police brutality, more common law enforcement actions, like arrests and street stops, can destabilize communities. These practices can lead to the loss of a job, housing, transportation, or educational opportunities, among other consequences. Such costs may also span areas including education, economic well-being, social engagement, and health. And for too long, the predominant approach to policing research has created critical gaps that leave policymakers and the public unable to make informed decisions about policing investments and the related role of policing in the production of public safety. The traditional approach to assessing police efficacy through cost-benefit analysis cannot answer the question of whether policing is worth the investment because it omits policing social costs. Put simply, we have treated policing and public safety as synonymous, and we must account for the full spectrum of effects that policing has on public safety and social welfare.
So I'm going to maybe I can be heard a little better. I will take us through some of the research. There are 4 areas that we have noted in the work that we've been looking at so far. We don't have time, obviously, to detail every individual study that we've found, but we just want to go through some of the key takeaways of the research so far. And some of this will be duplicative or it will reinforce, I should rather say, some of what was said earlier today. So, for instance, Philana in the previous session talked a lot about the educational impacts of police in schools, and that's something that there's a fairly large literature about. It's been pretty well established by now that police contact during youth has long-term negative effects on educational and intellectual growth. Police encounters with youth lead on average to lower GPAs and test scores. It also interferes with likelihood of graduation from high school and going to college. This especially impacts young BIPOC men who suffer from negative educational outcomes. For example, there was a study in LA that found that during the study period, nearly 2,000 Black and Latinx students dropped out of Los Angeles area schools as a result of police shootings that happened during the study period. There's also a number of, and I'm sorry, I have the wrong set of slides here, so I hope you'll bear with me a little bit. But there are also health effects. There's many health effects, and there's a lot of research on the health effects, and we've heard obviously about a lot of that in the earlier session as well. Police contact has uniquely negative effects for Black people. This is something that really stands out in research. And there's also a clear set of findings that show that as encounters become more intrusive and more derogatory, that those impacts increase. So youth are particularly vulnerable, suffering depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and sleep disturbances after even stop and frisk type contacts, as well as arrests. Police stops of youth can begin during really early adolescence. So in one of the studies, the average age of first contact was between 12 and 13 years old. Teen encounters with police are especially harmful when they happen in school, and it seems this is because of the presence of peers watching the incident. There's also a lot of studies that have found that men have particularly strong impacts that are not seen in women. This seems to especially affect BIPOC men. So men suffer more than women from PTSD, anxiety, feelings of worthlessness after police stops. And evidence suggests that men suffer more stress than women from both direct and indirect police encounters. What's interesting is that also indirect police encounters in the neighborhood, meaning vicarious experience of it through neighborhood social networks that convey the information about stops having happened, seem to have almost the same effect as directly experiencing the stop themselves. There's a framework called perceived discrimination. Yeah, I have the wrong slides here, so but that's fine. There's a framework called perceived discrimination that tries to explain why police encounters harm Black and brown people in unique ways. So the perception of discrimination is associated with poor health outcomes, and coping behaviors like smoking and drinking have negative health effects. Research supporting this includes studies that found, for example, that Black boys exposed to a recent police killing who were having their cortisol levels measured, which is a stress hormone, had a 64% increase in cortisol levels after a recent police killing. An effect that wasn't seen in Black girls or whites who were involved in the study. Also, after police killed an unarmed Black person, there was an 11% increase in depression-related emergency room visits by Black people within the same county. There's also an association between the increase in use of stop and frisk and use of force during stop and frisk incidents in a neighborhood with the diagnoses of diabetes, high blood pressure, and asthma among BIPOC residents of the neighborhoods. We don't see the same kind of effects on white residents. As far as effects on civic engagement, there's a few that I want to talk about quickly. And there's a framework that identifies these called system avoidance. So people with prior police contacts tend to protect themselves from attention by avoiding institutions that keep formal records. So this results, for example, in lower odds of having a bank account or getting medical care. In fact, those who are merely stopped and frisked but not arrested have 33% greater odds of not getting medical care they need. non-surveilling institutions like volunteer and religious groups don't have the same effects, and there's not the same kind of avoidance. Police impacts on political participation are kind of complex. So youth who are arrested have a lower likelihood of registering to vote or voting. However, there's an increase in political participation from those who are stopped and frisked. And there's also increases in voting by Latinx and Black people who are living in areas where there has been, in the immediate area, a shooting of an unarmed person. And then those effects hold for up to a decade. It's about a 5 to 10% increase in voting behavior. And they, those same effects are not seen when the person who's shot by police is unarmed. So it's interesting, there's a couple of studies that show that distinction really makes a difference in these impacts. So just looking toward a more expansive view of public safety and health, Aaron's already talked about this a bit, but what we're really looking for is a net, a way of measuring the net costs and benefits of policing. So the traditional literature talks a lot about how much we save by spending on police to reduce crime and prevent the harms that crime causes. What we really need to do is think more broadly and holistically about what public health is, and that public safety and public health really are the same thing, and that police, when they're causing these kind of harms while doing their jobs, are actually costing a lot of, they're creating a lot of costs that are not incorporated into those traditional measures. I'll hand it back to Aaron to wrap up.
Thanks, Dan. I'll wrap up with a few quick slides about two slides about future research. So our report will seek to provide a comprehensive overview and synthesis of the quantitative social science literature and the social costs of policing. This literature it's expanded rapidly since the protest following the murder of George Floyd. It's still emerging, and about a third of the papers that we're looking at have come out in the last 2 years alone. So there's an urgent need for additional empirical studies to develop the knowledge base on the consequences of policing, in addition to research that explores the relationship between policing and a range of outcomes that reflect public safety and welfare. And this slide provides an overview of some of the common themes that emerge from the gaps in each of these 4 mini literatures. For example, more research is needed that illuminates the mechanisms that drive disproportionate social harm for Black Americans. One final slide here. Including our review of the evidence, in addition to identifying gaps, we also tried to sketch out some broader questions that the social costs of policing literature provoked for us. So, for example, a research agenda might prioritize questions like whether participatory action research and other methods that center impacting people can improve future research on the social costs of policing, or what frameworks and strategies should be used to incorporate social costs into future cost-benefit analyses of policing. So, in summary, the stakes are high concerning the consequences of police contact with the general public. But for too long, these consequences have gone unignored or underappreciated in quantitative policing research. Policing comes with a host of consequences, collateral consequences, especially for Black and brown communities who have faced a history of discrimination and violence at the hands of law enforcement, which continues today. This history and contemporary reality alike are erased when studies view policing and public safety as synonymous or extricate American policing from the political and social context in which it occurs. Thank you.
Maybe more stuff. I was actually glad to see some of the research be funded at PHLR in your literature review. I'm now going to turn it over to Jamie and Parris.
Thank you very much for So our presentation is about the over-impact and underrepresentation of people with disabilities in police reform efforts. First of all, I'd like to thank you for welcoming us and the Institute of Disabilities at Temple University to be part of this symposium today. I'd also like to recognize, as Professor Parris mentioned, Philana Pelligrino, 2L here at Temple, who's been volunteering with the Institute and helping us with this research, and also our Executive Director of the Institute, Sally Gould-Taylor, for supporting us in this work. I think it's important for you to understand who we are as an institute, to understand where we come from in the course of this work. So the Institute is part of the College of Education and Human Development here at Temple University. And as you can see on this slide, we are a University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, or what is also known as a UCED. Each state and territory in the United States has at least one UCED. And here in Pennsylvania, we have the distinction of serving as the only UCED being housed here on Temple's campus, but serving the entire state of Pennsylvania. So what is a University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disability? Well, as a University Center, we work directly with individuals and families across Pennsylvania who have intellectual or developmental disabilities or autism. And through some of our projects, we also work on a cross-disability basis with other disabilities. Our responsibilities include research, education, training, and service. And unlike some other organizations here at Temple, we are really a community-facing center. So we work directly with people in communities across Pennsylvania. I focus my work on policy, and my colleague Parris focuses his work on criminal justice, sexuality, and disability, and the intersection of those things. So this is really what brings us to the symposium today. The work we are presenting on today is part of a literature review. So it's a combination of research around the disparate impact on people of color and with disabilities when it comes to their interactions with police, as well as, we think very importantly, lived experience of people with disabilities and people with disabilities of color, and how that impacts people, and it should also influence our efforts in society to undertake police reform. You can go ahead, Parris. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what is disability, because we think it's important to understand what we are speaking of when we speak of disability. Parris is going to tell you some stories from the field or share some lived experiences with you and review some statistics that we found in our literature review. We also have a few legal cases that we've highlighted in our materials. We'll get to those if we have time to. And then finally, we will make some recommendations for how police reform might move forward, doing a bit better to take into account the lived experiences of people with disabilities, in particular with people with disabilities in health. So in our materials, you'll see that I talk about the fact that there are many different definitions of disability and what that means. So one of the definitions that I'm highlighting here is legal definition taken directly from the Americans with Disabilities Act, which many of you may recognize. But I think it's also important to highlight that there are social, medical, and cultural definitions of disability as well. Sometimes we don't take into account in our research. Sometimes we don't take into account in our legal work, and that we may need to take into account when we're talking about police reform. You can go ahead, Parris. So I'm going to spend some time on the social model just a bit. So this legal definition, as I said, that we just saw, is only part of the big picture. In order to understand disability, the police, as well as others who are involved in the legal process, including attorneys, need to see this legal picture, including gaining a better understanding of these models of disability. So in the social model, we talk about the impairment that the person has, then any limitations that are posed by this impairment, and then we get to participation restrictions. And where I really want to focus my discussion is on the role of participation restrictions, because these restrictions can include any problem that is experienced by a person with a disability when that person is interacting in the larger community. And these are the kinds of problems that our literature review shows people often encounter when their disability intersects with some interaction that they're having with the police. So at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Parris, who's going to share with you some stories, lived experience, and highlight how this lack of understanding of disability also leads not just to these participatory restrictions or participation restrictions, but also, unfortunately, to harm. The research that we've reviewed suggests that this is due, at least in part, to the fact that disability information is rarely considered or even collected by the police in their interactions. And Parris will also address that.
Yes, thank you so much, Jamie. So yes, like she said, what I want to do is we're going to be getting into some statistics, but I want to kind of frame what we're talking about when we get into the statistics. So these are just 4 examples of different scenarios, but are they don't represent the entirety of the issue. So we're going to start with Ray-Leone, Extravaganza, Kubelet, Polanco. Ray-Leone was a trans woman who has epileptic seizures. She was arrested and housed in Rikers Island, pretty much because she could not afford to pay her bail. While being held, Ray-Leone was exhibiting symptoms of depression. So she had fits of crying, she was feeling very angry at times, and this led to her getting into a fight with another inmate. So the Rikers staff were trying to figure out where can they put Ray-Leone, and they consulted with the prison psychiatrist, who told them that Ray-Leone cannot be put in solitary confinement because of her history of epileptic seizures. That was disregarded, and Ray-Leone was put in solitary confinement and died after having a epileptic seizure. Right as this was kind of happening, a guard saw Ray-Leone laying on the floor, unresponsive, left her there, and Ray-Leone did not receive the care that could have saved her life. Deborah Danner was a woman with schizophrenia. She was at home, and a neighbor called 911 and reported that Deborah was acting erratic. This led to the EMTs first coming to Deborah's home. Deborah was armed with some scissors, and the EMT calmed her down, got her to put the scissors down. And following that, the police came. After some interaction, Deborah moved to her bedroom to kind of get some space. A police officer followed her. Deborah picked up the bat, swung at the officer, and the officer shot her twice and killed her. Then we have Pearl Pearson Jr. Pearl is a deaf man who was driving home from a deaf group. On his way home, he was pulled over by police officers. The police officers were giving him orders. Pearl could not hear them. So when he rolled down his window, the police began to beat him for a total of 7 minutes. It was really hard finding this picture of him actually looking like a human, because if you search Pearl, all of the pictures are of him being brutalized. It's actually really graphic. But this was all stemming from the fact that he could not hear. The police were actually responding to, I believe, an assault, or maybe it's like a hit and run. And Pearl was not involved with the the crime that happened, but was brutalized for it regardless. And then we have Clifford Owensby. This case actually is the most recent. Clifford was driving home or driving from a place that had suspected drug activity. Clifford did have window tints that were too dark. So he was pulled over. The police requested him to exit the vehicle. Clifford informed them that he could not. He had help getting into this car because he has paraplegia. And the police said that they could help him, but Clifford asked that somebody else be able to help him out because he did not feel safe with the police officers. And they proceeded to drag him out of the car by his hair. So, 55% of Black men with disabilities are arrested by the age of 28. So, as kind of, so yes, 55% of Black men with disabilities are arrested by the age of 28. We've kind of understood why, because like we've heard from other presenters that there's a lot of surveillance of communities that may be more disenfranchised, and that interlinks with disability and also race. Researchers estimate that people with disabilities are up to half of people killed by the police, and the rates of non-lethal violence by police against people with disabilities is theorized to be way higher than that 50%. So a little bit of context, the reasons that we kind of like understand the patterns of race and police brutality more so than disability is because of what information is collected at the time of race. And that usually is restricted to just height, weight, gender, and race. So there isn't a database that keeps track of violence at the hands of officers. What we are seeing is that the tracking of these cases is reliant on the news, but a lot of news organizations are doing that work for us. So Jamie, I don't think we have time for legal.
No, so thank you for that, Parris. We will skip over the legal landscape, and I'll just close it out for us by saying that we encourage you to take a look at our recommendations and our materials, and I will just highlight a couple of those because I think it relates to some of what the other panelists are speaking about. One of our recommendations is to fund and implement mental health teams who would respond with the police to situations involving people with mental health issues and or other disabilities. And we also would encourage that police training on this topic, which we know we always hear about in both cases and in the community, moving forward should include lived experience of people with disabilities and people with disabilities as trainers so that we can get their perspective as we try to change culture in the police, and as was mentioned earlier, to train our next generation of advocates. Thank you.
Well, I think we'll look forward to hearing more of you and questions later today. So go ahead and set up Rachel Shaw, our final presenter, who is virtual.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen here. All right, thank you. So today I'm going to be focusing on law and policy levers that can be used to reduce police intervention and suicide prevention activities. In order to understand how to achieve racial health equity, it's important to understand key issues operating at the intersection of suicide prevention and race. First, there's the reality of structural and systemic racism, which generally refers to how laws, policies, practices, and norms come together to create systems that generally render people of color worse off. An example of this in suicide prevention is the fact that many suicide prevention interventions are tested primarily on white populations, yet treated as universally applicable. Only recently have people begun to acknowledge that they have limited applicability to people of color. Second, many jurisdictions have issued declarations of racism as a public health crisis. And in those declarations, they've made commitments not just to listen to people of color, but to give them a voice, which means allowing people of color to shape policy. And this raises a question of how are we going to respond to calls for less policing through no contact with the police, not partnerships with police? Third, the COVID-19 pandemic has revealed an increased need for mental health support for people of color. Throughout the pandemic, symptoms of anxiety and depression have increased, but they've especially increased at various points for Black and Hispanic people, including depression and anxiety. We've seen that suicide rates overall have started to decline, but in some jurisdictions during the pandemic, even as rates declined for white people, they increased for Black and Hispanic people. And of course, before COVID-19, Native American and Alaska Native people have always been at extremely high risk for suicide attempts and death by suicide. There's also the issue of disproportionate use of police force. There's large consensus that it's grossly under-tracked, but the data that we do have consistently shows that Black, Hispanic, and Native American people are subject to disproportionate police killings relative to white people and to their population. Force often happens when police engage in mental health and crisis welfare checks. For example, the research collaborative Mapping Police Violence found that mental health or welfare checks resulted in police killing 97 people in 2020. And we can't forget the harms of non-fatal force, which, as just discussed in the last presentation, can be quite violent. To design systems that treat the disproportionate use of fatal and non-fatal force against people of color as unimportant and irrelevant to suicide prevention is a form of systemic racism because it ignores the disparate racial impacts. And finally, we have a system that overly relies on police to respond to people in crisis by default through 911, but also by design through co-responder models that pair police with mental health professionals to respond to people in crisis. There are some benefits to these models, but they're not evidence-based practices shown to reduce the use of force, and more importantly, any racial disparities in force. We can't simply ignore that if we're going to take racial health equity seriously. So a recent development in suicide prevention is the rollout of 988, which the federal government has mandated must be the universal code to access the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline and the Veteran Crisis Lifeline by July 2020. It's easy to remember during a crisis, and importantly, it's an alternative to calling 911. In enacting 988 legislation, Congress also authorized a fee to provide 988 services, including routing calls and providing acute mental health crisis outreach and stabilization services. And this includes mobile crisis response, which I'll be focusing on here. This is just a quick snapshot of some legislative trends in 988. Much of this legislation is still in progress, but you can see there at least some of the legislation raises equity concerns, including reducing reliance on police. So as states have begun to sketch out what mobile crisis response teams might look like in their state, we can ask the question, how well are states meeting the concerns of racial health equity? And the answer varies depending on how states answer two questions. First, who is on the team and who else can show up? Generally, all states have more than one definition of what constitutes a mobile crisis response team, but they all define at least one team to include a mental health or behavioral health professional and peer support specialists. But as you can see illustrated here, Nevada reverts, or I should say, perpetuates the co-responder models because it allows for law enforcement to be part of a mobile crisis response team. The second is who else can show up even if they're not on the team. Some states in their legislation include language limiting law enforcement intervention, but other states have no language limiting law enforcement intervention. This is just an example of what this legislation looks like, legislation that's passed in Nevada and proposed in Massachusetts. And you can see that the Nevada model has some good stuff in it, but it fails to address concerns about disproportionate use of force. And so it's not a good example of racial health equity. I'm not saying that there's no role for law enforcement, but co-responder models keep police in the starting lineup. So what I am saying is when you look at disproportionate use of force, it's clear that the answer is to take law enforcement out of the starting lineup and put them on the bench. Think of them as your bench specialist, the player who you might only call out for limited minutes if you need a specific skill. Massachusetts provides that standard for when to call police off the bench. So as you see here, it says, mobile behavioral crisis responders shall collaborate with local law enforcement agencies and include police as co-responders and behavioral health teams only as needed to respond in high-risk situations that cannot be managed without the assistance of law enforcement personnel. Massachusetts includes safeguards limiting unnecessary police contacts. The next example I want to turn to is anonymous school tip lines. These were initially implemented to address school violence related to school shootings. They generally operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And their focus is at least initially, was primarily on protecting others from potential violence. Most states have a tip line, but many less have actually implemented a tip line via state legislation. I looked at the 12 states that have tip lines that have been enacted through state legislation. And what you find is that in actuality, the tip lines tapped into unmet needs, students who are grappling with their own mental health and well-being in ways that pose a risk of harm to self, not to other. So as you see here, in 9 out of 12 states that pass laws implementing tip lines, suicide-related tips were among the top 3 reported tips. In 5 of those states, suicide-related tips were number 1. Other top tips that dominated the tip lines included identified suicide risk factors such as depression and self-harm. Also, what you find is that in some states during virtual learning due to COVID-19, specifically Colorado and Pennsylvania, reports of suicide risk and or self-harm rose even as overall tips decline. So what you find here is that the tip lines are a great tool for suicide prevention and supporting the health and well-being of students. The problem is that although they've created promising new pathways to support students in crisis, there are also points that need reform to strengthen them. First, not all of them are embedded in a mental health and crisis support framework. And also, they're not fully attentive to the impacts of policing on youth, which marginalizes experiences of youth of color. A recent study, for example, in California found that Black youth had the highest rate of hospital-treated injuries caused by law enforcement. Can't simply ignore that reality. So as illustrated here, most of the state enacted tip lines have a law enforcement orientation, meaning that they're administered, triaged, and responded to by law enforcement. So they might be embedded in a state police department or a state department of public safety. The technicians in here by state law have broad discretion as to whether to send school administrators to respond and or law enforcement. And absent specific limits, we don't know how that discretion is used. There's little data also on when law enforcement intervenes and what the outcomes are. So for example, in Oregon, they've reported that law enforcement may be sent for urgent tips, including suicide ideation. But there's no information on how it's determined when law enforcement will be sent and what happened next. So what were the outcomes? There are some promising models that better fit with racial health equity in Nebraska, North Carolina, and Utah, because there, the tips directly go to crisis counselors who also triage the tips. And in Nebraska, state law further requires that the crisis counselors are trained in suicide prevention, and they're required to use de-escalation techniques to minimize law enforcement intervention. Colorado also recently reformed its tip lines so that it previously required all tips to be sent promptly to a school team or to law enforcement. But it recently revised its law so that tips relating to mental health or substance use may instead be sent to the state's behavioral crisis response team. Given the initial reason for the tip lines, school violence, embedding these programs into law enforcement agencies, and treating law enforcement as co-responders to school administrators may have on its face made sense. But given the actual usage of the lines, the tip lines must be reimagined to serve the mental health and crisis needs of youth when there's a risk to self, not to others, and to take into account youth of color's needs and their experience with the police. It should not be treated as secondary. Accounting for the experiences of youth of color is essential to protecting their mental health and well-being. In conclusion, it's time to listen to voices saying aggressive policing is a crisis, including a public health crisis. It's time to treat people of color as the best, most informed knowers of their life experience and what serves their needs. It's in that spirit that I have identified these levers to reduce law enforcement intervention in suicide prevention infrastructure and encourage others to explore these opportunities. Thank you.
Okay, we'll have a few minutes of questions, then we have to do sort of a quick lunch because of COVID restrictions and get back for our program. Yes?
Yeah, thanks very much for a great set of talks. I was wondering if scholars from Vera or maybe other people on the panel could help us theorize when I see an important disconnect between research and electoral outcomes. So it strikes me in the last set of elections in urban America, if you think of places like Seattle or Minneapolis or New York, that public policies and also candidates who are emphasizing what was called the social cost of policing didn't fare very well with voters, including with minority voters, who the last speaker talked about as, the most informed knowers. So how do we theorize that? How do we theorize the disconnect between this very powerful line of research about these social costs and the need to really reduce the footprint of what's called aggressive policing and some of these electoral outcomes, especially among minority voters?
Well, that's an easy question. Yeah. And feel free to hold the mic like that.
Simple, straightforward, problem solved, no real serious difficulties there. Yeah, my director is here, Danielle Bodah, who I saw had her hand up, but give me a moment, I'll try to address it. There's a very strong narrative that's playing out right now about crime. And this is a narrative that we know really well, that we've grown up with, that we've seen on television and movies for decades, for our whole lives. We've been steeped in that narrative. So I think when it's brought up again, when, for instance, the homicide rate in the United States ticks up, then that narrative follows, right? The National Crime Victimization Survey was just recently released. It's probably our best measure of what actually happens with crime in the United States, because it actually asks people if they've experienced crime. So the FBI crime reports are based on reports to police. A lot of stuff is not reported to police. The National Crime Victimization Survey data that just came out from the Department of Justice shows steady decreases in crime over time. Now that's not to make light of the the serious increase in homicides and some other violent crimes right now. Those are happening, it's true. But overall, even violent crime is still going downward and trending downward. So I think that those kind of narratives drive electoral politics in a way that is disconnected. They have emotional valence that it's difficult to counter with a lot of data. You know, I think voters reacting to those emotional narratives. We really need to find ways to elevate community voices, and that's part of why we're doing this cost policing work, where we want to now go out and speak with people in communities and elevate those voices so those kind of impacts are not just facts, but narratives associated with them that will hopefully be compelling enough to have that kind of influence.
I think we typed in your article, defund the police. No, go right ahead.
Well, I think, really appreciate your question, and in particular, the focus on theory. I think, our lit review doesn't highlight solutions necessarily, because that's not the focus of the lit review, but I think when we're thinking about how to, compel people to account for the social costs, taking heed around the, behavioral economics research and behavioral science research around challenges. Simply like the idea, it's hard to take away something if you're not presenting a solution, and generally people are attached to what they have. So accounting for the reference point that we've used policing in the way that we have for so long, and there aren't that many robust examples that we can point to in communities that illustrate the benefits of an alternative approach. And so being realistic about, you know, sort of human instincts and behaviors around reference points and what we're losing, and presenting solutions, I think will be important moving forward.
We have time for one more. Yes. Wait, recording.
As far as the political will to deal with the facts and the research that you've all presented, is it more than just this emotional approach taken on by the politicians? What I'm suggesting is that isn't some of it the fact that, you know, we have all this money in politics because of the Supreme Court decision, and therefore an outside voice is given in public policy to those that control a lot of political funds, and those that are power politically really don't have the will to deal with the issues that we've been discussing, because they mostly affect people at the margins of society that they don't care about. Am I too cynical?
I think that's a great, we ended the last session with a reference to the problem of money and finance for municipalities and how that drives so many of the fines and fees problems. And now I think we can end well with the recognition that our political system is not answering to people who are experiencing these social costs. So I want to thank all of our panelists for bringing these issues forward and challenging us to think about how we change our thinking and action, and maybe improve our theories and messaging when it comes to driving these issues forward, because the evidence of harm is so compelling. Thanks very much. I'll turn it over. Yes. I thought we ended it. Look, you want everybody back here at 12:25, right?
Yes, 12:30.
Okay. Well, it's 12:30. My little list said 12:25. Okay. Well, let's by all means, let's take another question. If planners are allowed. Yes.
A good example that brings a lot of presentations together. My partner works in residential homes. My partner works in residential homes for adults with developmental disabilities. And one of the problems that they consistently face is, you know, some of the residents will engage in self-harm, such as headbutting the wall. And so 911 is called frequently. And so one of the issues is that when calling 911, like they try to specifically request, please don't send police, you know, we just need a paramedic. And every single time, the police not only show up, they show up first. And so they're, engaging with these individuals in potentially these really harmful ways, and it's, it's very difficult to advocate in those situations. And, another issue with that is also that some of the residents are frankly traumatized from the police just showing up, as well as the staff. And so I just, wanted to sort of present that and think about how to incorporate this perspective in some of the solutions that you've all mentioned.
And I think part of the challenge here is instead of like the community infrastructure available, right, to send the appropriate type of first responders to some of these calls. And so you can only dispatch the first responders that are available to you, right? I think that's going to tell you that we need to invest in different types of first responders so that we have the best fit for this problem. So I think we need to look more broadly in community investment and also asking questions about are there types of first responders we haven't invented yet. Peer specialists, community members themselves who might be best suited to address some calls in communities and build up that type of first response option as well.
Yeah, I wanted to make three very brief points that I think bring together some of these questions. So first, in terms of, there's no question, right, that I think advocates are more ambitious and expansive views of what policing and public safety should look like. I had a tough time. I would say I sort of read I wouldn't frame the results, I think, quite the way the first responders. I think it's been a little more mixed, right? You have what happened in Minneapolis, at the same time Austin, right? There was a proposition that got voted down to preserve minimum staffing levels and expand funding for policing. And so I think, what does that reflect? Is it statistical bias or something else? The reality is also, before sort of protest moment 2 summers ago, we had 1 or 2 cities that were, as Jen talked about, right, experimenting with non-police response programs to behavioral health crises, right? We now have like 10, 12 cities that are running pilots. That's the kind of the power of sort of alternative public safety systems of practice, the work that's kind of happening on the ground in communities. And also to the sort of campaign finance point, right? There has been all this there's this sort of money and infrastructure around pushing certain narratives about the police, right? I think the social cost literature that we're presenting is not framed like that, right? But there are the same kind of resources behind counter narratives, and we don't know what those might look like in the future.
I have a question, perhaps for the Network for Public Health Law or Jen or Evan, around actually really anyone around the risk burden. So some of what you shared, illustrated the public asking for something that doesn't exist, and then the risk and consequences being held by the public rather than the state. The state sends who they send because they got a call and it's a liability not to respond. I'm curious if in the research whether officers themselves spoke to that or whether there's been any consideration around like recognizing that the necessity for that shift.
Absolutely. And I think another answer to the question of the politics of it all is many communities don't trust police, but they continue to call them because they trust public health, all of us, even less, because we haven't been there. Because the mobile psych team doesn't show up because there's no infrastructure. Because all of our money is jammed into academic centers and cities like Penn and Temple, not out in the community, creating community-based services. So, I think that's an overgeneralization, but the officers that we've spoken to don't see them, they don't think it's appropriate for them, to be involved in it. Particularly things like, our commitment proceedings locally, 302 process right now. They don't think they should be involved at all. And they appreciate that their presence can have this triggering effect. But there isn't an infrastructure to deal with that otherwise. There aren't cars, and there's a lot of low-hanging fruit to stand up these programs.
Yes.
to respond to a couple of things. But if they ask a question, if you don't mind, because I'm a former police officer. I'm a former police officer, so is my colleague next to me. And I'm also black. The question that the gentleman over there raised about why black people didn't go for it. Well, they didn't go for it because it wasn't nothing else on. And what was on the screen. So if you have to dance and jump through hoops to get what it is that's on the screen. So police have been very successful in marketing themselves over the period of time that they have existed. And as this 24-hour government service that's available. And believe it or not, black folks know that it ain't the best thing for them, but they also know that it's available. And they also know a few of them who humanely do their job with a humane approach and sense about it. But all of this don't mean nothing if somehow none of that money that goes into the excessive money that goes to the police somehow enough doesn't go into the necessary social services that exist in our city that really serve the needs of people. They're going to keep on looking at that way. Because how can you, the police don't have nothing to do with housing with that. And we've known that for a long time. That's a big secret. They don't have nothing to do with getting people in the house. But if the money doesn't go to the house in the budget so that the people that house can help the people who need house, then there's going to continue to be issues around residents and housing. And then they have to deal with those restricted laws and provisions that put people out who are doing things in housing, or if your children smoke marijuana in government housing and all that BS. So it's not surprising that they went that route, because we were talking about it. And I'm going to be matter of fact, I'm even for a box. And I used to be a police officer. And it's not because I'm crazy, it's because they're police creating the problem that's laid at their footsteps right there. They created the problem. Black folks didn't create the problem. They didn't abuse themselves. The police abused them. So how long do I have to be abused by somebody in order to reject it? Even when we talk about domestic violence. At some point, you got to talk about leaving the person who will beat your ass. So let's be real.
Well, I think that's an even more powerful conclusion than the last conclusion that we thought we had when we came up with the soon. Again, I was struck by the fact that we're constantly talking about how we manage scarcity in what's supposedly the richest country in the world, and which is exceptional among comparable countries in creating and maintaining this kind of scarcity for basic social needs. So it's a funny thing. Now I'm going to turn it over to Sarah to tell us what the drill is for lunch. We'll have more discussion as the day proceeds.
Thank you. I know we didn't hear from Parris and Jamie on any of the questions. You guys want to just respond to any of the questions in like a short couple minutes?
Thanks, Sarah. I just wanted to add one thing, and that was to recognize the young lady who brought up the needs of people with intellectual disabilities in our larger community, and to tie that back to the comment that was made about having community-based services. I think what you described there really is a symptom of a bigger problem, which is that if the staff, the direct support professionals who are working in the community homes feel like the response that they need to go to is to call 911 and call EMS and potentially the police. I think that speaks to a larger issue around training of our direct support professional staff who are doing their best every day to work in these homes and to support people with disabilities. And that's one reason why we are strongly supportive of the additional funding for home community-based services, and also for looking at trying to professionalize the role of the staff who do support people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in our
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our panelists.